Taiwanese men to their death, recognized Kerr as an American official and gave him a snapsy salute. George Kerr writes in his book that this was the ultimate act of betrayal by America. Kerr kept cabling for help, help that never came. Finally, a Republic of China airplane flew to the island from the mainland, and a lone American military officer stepped out of the plane, got into a Jeep, was driven around Taipei for a couple of hours, got back on the plane, said everything's okay. And that's what Harry Truman wanted to hear. By now, the Cold War was raging. We went straight from World War II to the Cold War. Instead of fighting the Japanese and the Germans, now we were fighting the communists, the Russians, and the threat of Red China. This is what occupied Truman's mind. Truman was preparing a plan, later called the Truman Doctrine. And what was the Truman Doctrine? I'm going to read several sections out of the Truman Doctrine. And this was Truman's declaration to the world: the United States would fight communism. The date of the Truman Doctrine was March 12th, 1947. What I'm getting ready to read to you is written and issued while the killing is still going on in Taiwan. With the 228 massacre underway, Truman says this: one of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free of coercion. This was a fundamental issue in the war with Germany and Japan. Our victory was won over countries which sought to impose their will, their way of life upon other nations. And yet at that very moment, in Taiwan, a way of life was being imposed on the residents of the island while Truman is issuing this very statement. Truman goes on and explains the Truman Doctrine is to help free people to maintain their free institutions and their national integrity against aggressive movements that seek to impose upon them totalitarian regimes. There is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed on free people by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and the security of the United States. And yet, while he was saying that, that's exactly what was happening at Formosa. Truman went on and said, the peoples of a number of countries of the world have recently had totalitarian regimes forced on them against their will. That's what happened in Formosa. Truman says, when a minority forcibly is imposed on a majority, it relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. That's the martial law that was imposed on Formosa. Truman says, I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. We must assist the free people to work out their destinies in this way. Well, apparently that applied to everywhere in the world but Taiwan. Truman says one thing and did another. A little later, let me back up. Not long after that, Chiang loses in China, escapes to exile in Formosa, bringing with him 1.5 million of his generals, his secret police, and the wealthy elite. Commoners, not welcome. Regular soldiers, left behind. Now suddenly there are 2 million nationalist Chinese on the island. A huge secret police network is already in place. They've got something to do. The White Terror begins. After Chiang moved into Taiwan in 1949, the United States had to kind of reevaluate their decision. And that's what led to Dean Acheson saying, well, maybe we should support an uprising. And led to the discussion about maybe we should drive the Chinese from the island. But it didn't happen. And then, in 1950, fighting breaks out in Korea. And the outbreak of the Korean War locked, from that time until this very day, Taiwan into an unsettled, unresolved ambiguity. The Taiwan question, the Taiwan problem, the strategic ambiguity. Judge Janice Rogers Brown, in April of this year in the Roger Lynn lawsuit, called it political purgatory. Harry Truman sent a message to the United Nations through his ambassador to the United Nations in August of 1950 about Formosa. Here's what Harry Truman had to say in 1950. By this point, Truman realized that through his ignorance and inattention in 1945 and 1947, that he'd made a mistake. This is what he said in 1950. The action of the United States about moving the Chinese into Formosa was expressly stated without prejudice to the future political settlement of the status of the island. The actual status of the island is territory taken from Japan by victory of the Allied forces in the Pacific. Like other such territories, its legal status cannot be fixed until there is international action to determine its future. The Chinese government was asked by the Allies to take surrender of the Japanese forces on the island, and that is the reason the Chinese are there now. Truman went on and said, the United States would welcome the United Nations' consideration of the case of Formosa, and we would approve full United Nations investigation there. We believe that the United Nations consideration would contribute to a peaceful rather than a forceful situation to the problem. But it didn't happen. China was on the Security Council. No United Nations action. Truman realized that the only way that the matter could be resolved was by treaty, some sort of international agreement, or action of the United Nations. Since action of the United Nations was out of the question, a treaty plan was devised. The San Francisco Peace Treaty, 1952. The San Francisco Peace Treaty was written by the American government. Japan did not write the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Japan signed it. The United States wrote it. In the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan surrenders all claims to Taiwan. At that point, it's in the United States' hands. And our proxy government, the Republic of China in exile, on the island itself. Truman said, well, the status has got to be resolved in the future. Then he's out of office. Now we've got a new president, Dwight Eisenhower, a general. Eisenhower didn't do much about Formosa in his first year in office. He was still busy dealing with Korea. In 1954, the Chinese started shelling Quemoy and Matsu. The Republic of China government had put a lot of soldiers on these two islands. It became a center of attention. So Eisenhower developed a treaty, a defense treaty, with the Republic of China in exile. On December 1st, 1954, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, the same man who wrote the San Francisco Peace Treaty for the American government, said this to the American people. The treaty will recognize the common interest of the parties in the security of Taiwan and the Pescadores and of the Western Pacific Islands under the jurisdiction of the United States, Guam and so forth. That put a lid on things for a while. Hostilities increased. In 1955, Eisenhower went to Congress to talk about the defense of Formosa. Here's what Eisenhower said to Congress in January 1955. Since the end of Japanese hostilities in 1945, Formosa and the Pescadores have been in friendly hands of our loyal ally, the Republic of China. We have recognized that it was important that these islands should remain in friendly hands. In unfriendly hands, Formosa and Pescadores would seriously dislocate the existing, if unstable, balance of moral, economic, and military forces upon which the peace of the Pacific depends. I wonder if the people on Taiwan suffering under martial law felt they were in the friendly hands of the Republic of China. Eisenhower went on and said, in the interest of peace, the United States must remove any doubt regarding our readiness to fight, if necessary, to preserve the vital stake of the free world in a free Formosa, and engage in whatever operations may be required to carry out that purpose. Was it a free Formosa for the people of the island? No. By free Formosa, he just means it wasn't communist. He wasn't talking about freedom for the residents of the island. No respect or regard or discussion for their human rights, for their rights of self-determination. Truman, once again, we would welcome action by the United Nations, which might bring an end to the active hostilities in the area. Well, once again, that didn't happen. The matter goes on. 1958, more shelling, more fighting, more threats against Taiwan by the Chinese. Once again, Eisenhower, this time, instead of going to Congress, calls a news conference and goes to the American public. This is what Eisenhower